I'm working on my 2009 Chevy Cobalt, and today I'm going to be replacing the oil pressure sensor. The oil pressure sensor is right down there, right below the oil filter housing, and it's a one wire connector. And basically what you're going to do is use the specialty socket that's meant for oil pressure sensors, and you're going to use a little stubby extension. Get in there, put it over it after disconnecting the sensor. And if you don't have a stubby extension, you can use a universal joint as well, and that gives you just enough room to get past the oil filter housing, and you can get a wrench in there and wrench it off. The car currently has 352,923 miles on it. So when your gauges go crazy, almost all the time it's a ground issue. And usually I've tracked it down to the wiring harness rubbing against the oil filter housing before. Sometimes it's a fuse in the fuse box, and a lot of times it's basically because your ECU isn't getting a correct ground. But this one's a very different symptom, so I thought I'd bring you along. Basically, oil is going from the oil pressure sensor, which is right down there, and here's what it looks like. And oil is either being pressurized into the wire, or it's wicking up into the wiring harness and into the ECU. When I first saw this problem, what I thought it was oil coming from the valve cover gasket and then leaking into the wiring harness through the wiring harness plastic shield. But when I took that off and then put a piece of napkin around there, it still gets oil in here. Let me show you what that looks like. So you pull back this red safety piece right here, and then you pull down the plastic, and then you can see all the oil right down here pooling up, and that is coming from the oil pressure sensor switch. We're working on Chevy Cobalts for a while. Currently I have 5 and this is the first time I've ever seen the gauges going crazy caused by this. But it is always a ground issue, so if you keep that in mind, usually you can track it down. You can see how covered with grease the oil pressure sensor is. Can't really show much because it's hard to get to and still film. And if you look up, you can see how it's covered with oil, literally just pushing right into there, and it's coming directly from the oil pressure switch right there. So I'll pull that out real quick, and I will show you on an engine I have out of the car where it is. Here's the oil filter housing, and the oil pressure monitor switch is right here. It takes a specialty tool. It looks like it's a 1 1/16 size, but you need the deeper socket that allows the electrical connection in there. And here's the new part, and there's the part number. I always order GM genuine parts whenever I can. And then basically it slips right in here and then goes into there. A regular socket just won't fit in there the same. So you do have to get creative with your extensions and universal joints to get around all the stuff down here without having to take off your intake manifold. Now I got 352,000 miles out of this oil pressure sensor, and even though I knew it would fail, I definitely didn't think it'd fail this way. Let's pull it out and take a look at it. And that is where the oil is getting into the ECU, shooting probably straight through those little holes, or straight through this hole into there. You can see the pressure pin in there into the ECU right down there. And you can see on my parts car engine, here is the ECU with the cover off the connector, and it's right on the bottom row where if it's squirting oil, it's filling this entire cavity full of oil, and it is a straight shot to the sensor. So these things have a little plastic pin in here, and then a copper washer, and sometimes they'll wear out, I guess. I've never actually, I work on Cobalts all the time. I've actually never seen this issue where oil has been shooting through the wire into the ECU, but I can definitely see how it happened. So basically this has failed, and then it's been sending oil right into this part, and like I said, this was just full of oil, and it sent oil from here straight in there, just pretty much like a pressurized straw. Alright, so the new one comes with the copper washer, and then it looks like it has a little Loctite or sealant built in. You always want to start it by hand because you are going into aluminum block. You always want to thread these by hand first. That way there's no chance of cross-threading it. Well, there's less of a chance. Then you can see in the mirror. We actually can see without the mirror, but it's right there. I'm going to get the socket on it, torque it down to factory spec. Here we go. This back on. There we go. So now to clean off the ECU real good. And you should disconnect the battery anytime you disconnect something electrical like the ECU. There is all that nasty oil. Let me get this to the bench. So I'm going to come back in a few days and take this off and re-clean it real good after the residual kind of gets pushed out. That is replacing your oil pressure monitor, a 2009 Chevy Cobalt. Like I said, the kind of crazy symptoms for an oil pressure monitor going bad. The gauge is going crazy, the bad ground for the ECU, but it happened on this car, so I'm sure it's happened on other Chevy Cobalts. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. The oil pressure sensor is right down there, right below the oil filter housing, and it's a one wire connector. And basically what you're going to do is use the specialty socket that's meant for oil pressure sensors, and you're going to use a little stubby extension. Get in there, put it over it after disconnecting the sensor. And if you don't have a stubby extension, you can use a universal joint as well, and that gives you just enough room to get past the oil filter housing, and you can get a wrench in there and wrench it off. And I do have an engine from a parts car that I have set out to demonstrate, because like I said, it's going to be impossible to film when I'm doing it. I still am going to film it, but you won't be able to see much. So basically you go down here right next to the oil filter housing, you disconnect the sensor, and then you slip the socket on with the little extension, and it gets you just right past the oil filter housing. Or if you need it a little shorter, if you need it a little shorter because your dipstick is a little bit closer, you slip on the socket and use a universal joint. And that is almost the perfect length to get in there right past oil filter housing, and your dipstick is right here. So you do have not very much room. The service data says to remove the starter, and this car is a California emission with the secondary air injector, so you actually have to remove the air pump and then the starter to get to that, but there's really no need. It's really accessible right through the top without removing the intake or the starter or anything. So after you get it down here past the oil filter housing, loosen it up, and it comes right off. And then when you're going back to put it back on, the new one, you want to make sure you feel the hole with your finger so you don't get it all dirty, and then put this in by hand in there. And then after you snug it by hand nice and tight, then you get the socket on there and give it a little snug. This is an aluminum block, so you want to be careful not to over tighten it. There are many symptoms for having a bad oil pressure sensor, but the symptom I was having was probably pretty unique. I noticed oil was getting into my ECU, and that was causing a ground issue with my ECU and causing the gauges to go crazy. So when I checked out the ECU after checking more of the common problems, I noticed it was full of oil. So I thought it was coming from the plastic housing that goes around the wiring harness, and I thought it was leaking. I thought it was leaking through the valve cover into the plastic housing and then making its way into the ECU. But after I removed the plastic housing, dried off all the oil really good, a couple weeks later it still was covered with oil. So I'm going to remove all that. I can show you that part. I can show you when I take this off, it's going to be full of oil. And when I take out the oil pressure sensor wiring, it's going to be full of oil as well. So basically this was using it as a pressurized like straw, sending oil straight from the oil pressure sensor right into the ECU. And you can see on my parts car engine, here is the ECU with the cover off the connector, and it's right on the bottom row where if it's squirting oil, it's filling this entire cavity full of oil, and it is a straight shot to the sensor. So these things have a little plastic pin in here, and then a copper washer, and sometimes they'll wear out, I guess. I've never actually, I work on Cobalts all the time. I've actually never seen this issue where oil has been shooting through the wire into the ECU, but I can definitely see how it happened. So basically this has failed, and then it's been sending oil right into this part, and like I said, this was just full of oil, and it sent oil from here straight in there, just pretty much like a pressurized straw. I do have a sensor that I took apart, and here is the end piece, and then here is where the wire goes, and you can see when it's broken open, there's that little pin. It just is shooting oil into that, right into the wire, and because there's a waterproof gasket around that wire, it's literally just pressurizing it. Not a common one, not a common problem, and like I said, I've never seen it before. I work on Cobalts all the time.